Alright, is everyone ready?
Just 1 second, please.
Okay. Tom will start my first order. Starting with the framing, the primary interest of the CCP in 1949 is stable economic growth for the peasant class. First, remember these peasants served as the main power base for the CCP's rise to power, fighting against the Japanese Imperial Army and the Chinese nationalist forces. They did this because the CCP promised redistributive economic policies that would allow them to escape poverty and access larger shares of the gains from their labor. The absence of peasant support would risk either mass revolt against the CCP or fracturing within the CCP, either of which would destroy the party's chance of successfully transitioning to a stable government. Remember, the CCP does not yet have the strong apparatus of state control or oppression. In the short term, they are reliant on buy-in from their power base to maintain control. Thus, as both sides of the house pivot their economies to light or heavy industry, the round will be decided by which pivot helps the peasants the most. Our first argument is that transitioning to light industry will be more economically feasible than transitioning to heavy industry. Subpoint A, heavy industry requires heavy investment. Heavy industry requires more startup investments than light industry. First, the manufacturing plants, energy infrastructure, and human capital requirements are all more complex and thus cost more. Moreover, these investments often have to run over a long-term time frame before the factory breaks a profit. However, the newly established CCP lacks a strong economic base. Most of the farmers are subsistence workers making low-value goods like rice. They are very difficult to tax because very little of the wealth is in the form of cash and their assets have low to zero value. Much of the urban infrastructure in China was destroyed during World War II or during the Civil War, so the cities will not provide a large tax base either. Thus, the CCP will not be able to invest in heavy industry at scale. This will create internal dispute within the party as more politically powerful members advocate to keep resources in their regions, leaving other regions destitute. This happens less with light industry, as first, smaller investments can be spread around more easily, and second, light industry makes profits faster, allowing that money be reinvested across China within a short time frame. The weighing is simple. If the CCP leaves behind current regions due to budget constraints, there's a high risk of revolt or internal party fracturing, both of which prevent any long-term benefit to China. Subpoint B is that heavy industry requires heavy importing. China will have to import raw materials to start up heavy industry. China's oil wells or mines were prime targets during warfare, leaving them inoperable. Even if China had the resources, though, it lacks the capabilities to refine petroleum or ore at scale, forcing them to turn to international markets. Western countries entering the Cold War will be very unwilling to support a communist government in China, so your only trading partner will be the USSR. The implication of this is that importing heavy industry destroys China's currency in the short term. China will be importing massive amounts of goods, but will not be ready to export anything until heavy industry is up and running, creating a net trade inflow. This means that China will have to send huge volumes of its currency outside of its borders to pay for the goods it is purchasing. China's domestic economy is not strong enough to support funding for these imports with its bonds, so China will have to print fiat currency to pay for these goods, leading to domestic inflation. In comparison, light industry requires a smaller quantity of raw materials and a greater diversity of raw materials and has a faster turnaround to exporting these goods. These reasons ensure you have less of a net export deficit and less inflation. Rampant inflation will wash away any economic gains for the peasant class. The success of the transition of power is a prior consideration to the long-term benefits. Our second argument is that even if the transition succeeds, a light industry economy is better for the Chinese state. Subpoint A, light industry is more economically diverse and agile. Light industry requires lower concentrations of investments in factories of production, and human capital, so the types of goods produced in light industrial environments will necessarily be more diverse. When you're making textiles, for instance, you can easily repurpose a mill to make clothing, sheets, or blankets, whereas it's much harder to retrofit a car manufacturing plant into one that makes trains. Notably, it is in the party's interest to create this diversity because spread out, stable wealth creation is the silver bullet for short-term economic stability. So in its capacity and not incentive, capacity and not incentive that controls the diversity of China's economic output. This structural diversity of light industry has three impacts. First, increased resilience to international demands. Western powers are very likely to try and subsidize competition for your exports to weaken and destabilize a communist economy. A light industry economy can easily pivot, avoiding that competition. Second, increased resilience to domestic demand. As peasants gain more economic freedom, their consumer preferences are likely to evolve rapidly. A light industry economy is better positioned to match those needs as they evolve. Finally, increased proximity to innovation. When you have multiple small factories, lower-level workers and officials are more empowered to suggest changes and improvements. Over time, the party can spread those improvements across all of China, leading to substantial gains. Subpoint B, light industry better aligns political incentives. The consolidation of heavy industry will create power bureaucratic incentives within the party, causing individual incentives to misalign with the overall goals of the CCP. When there is a specific factory whose production is critical to the economy of a province, region, or town, the CCP member in charge of that factory gains an outsized amount of political power, both locally and nationally. This then enables them to misrepresent production numbers, embezzle value, or cover up scandals that arise under their purview. Notably, the party will always be hesitant to check back against these individuals, as doing so may inhibit the economic productivity of their heavy industry plants, which are more likely to be too big to fail. Notably, while this can happen with light industry, the smaller scale, increased diversity, limited complexity, and expectations of positive growth make it substantially less likely, both because A, people will be more willing to check back against corrupt officials, and B, because enforcement creates deterrence against corruption in the first place. The weighing is simple. Even if the CCP wants to spread wealth to the peasantry, individual officials may be misaligned with the party goals. Corruption diverts wealth away from the working class, decreasing trust in the CCP governance, and increasing the likelihood of instability and state collapse. Subpoint C. Even if heavy industry works, peasants see less economic benefits. Heavy industry sees a higher concentration of labor substitution by machinery than light industry does. On the other hand, in light industry, automation is less plausible and less mandatory, ensuring a greater dependence on workers. Thus, heavy industry is characterized by a smaller number of high-paying jobs of people with the skills to work heavy machinery, whereas light industry is able to employ a large number with a relatively unskilled people. This ensures that economic gains of light industry are spread more widely. Remember, in 1949, China has a population of 500 million, many of whom have had their homes, farms, and livelihoods destroyed by World War II and the Chinese Civil War. They are presently unemployed and reliant on state support. These people are the greatest threat to the stability of the CCP. If the party does not follow through on its promises to grant them better economic conditions, they are likely to support another faction that will. Now, it is unlikely that either side of the House will achieve full structural employment with our policies, but light industry will employ more people across different skill sets and provide hope for every worker in China. 3 reasons why. First, light industry simply employs more people. Second, it's easier to train or retrain workers for light industry jobs. Third, because light industry produces profits faster than heavy industry, the state will have more money to spend on job training, education, or even welfare services like food aid, hospitals, or housing programs. The impact is not just practical, it also resonates through government messaging. Families who experience huge financial pressures on a single breadwinner and are likely to lead to political unrest and economic inequality. But second, unemployment means that capital is largely concentrated in the hands of few, further exacerbating supply-demand gaps, as most individuals cannot afford to purchase basic goods, meaning even things like cars become extreme luxuries. For all these reasons, I'm proud to propose.
Here we are. Just give me 1 second, please. Sorry about that. Alright. Framing off on. 3, 2, 1. 2 points of framing. First, what does the CCP care about? There are 2 main things. First is going to be on economic growth and the power of China in the region, and second is popular support and buy-in. This matters uniquely right now because China is still reeling from the social and economic ramifications of the recent Chinese Civil War, war against Japan, etc. People are angrier than they've been before, and your hold is tenuous, so you can't do things that would anger your base and population right now. Second point framing, is that you aren't going to be isolationist in the long run. The CCP cares a lot about political messaging. It cares about its reputation. It's worried about not being seen as a legitimate rising power. This proves that the CCP is already quite corrupt right now because they have interests that are very selfish and are very pertinent. They'll do a lot to protect them. This also is just empirically true. Isolationism strengthens this link because there are no outside institutions that they have to be afraid of or that can hold them accountable. This is why eventually the CCP tries to become super authoritarian. Given this, first argument. Once you open up trade, heavy industry is far better. It's far more stable on an export level. Diversification is good for all the warranting they provide for you. Heavy industry is an inherently more diverse option than light industry. It just covers more stuff. Between machinery, vehicles, and intensive raw material like cement, they just are more options to decide. It's also an intermediary good. It is far more stable because one industry collapsing doesn't collapse the manufacturing as a whole. This means that you get to sell more stuff, but also that your economy is more insulated from shocks. It will primarily be an export economy, which is good because you have a low value currency in order to make it easier for other countries to import. This is good for you because it keeps your trade balance in check because it reduces imports. This also insulates you against shocks from other countries. So if you don't rely nearly as much on other countries, then you are far more stable. You will be comparatively better off than you will be comparatively better than Russia and comparatively worse than other light industry countries. Countries that do light industry have huge historical bases, i.e. India. You can never beat their huge entrenched clothing industry, but you definitely can beat Russia, who has tons of political instability and no one really wants to trade with. Heavy industry is quite new because industrialization didn't happen that much. Things aren't as entrenched. It is far easier to compete on a mechanical level when you can always invest in things that have easy and understandable returns on investment, i.e. developing a machine allows you to produce more. On the comparative, it's far harder to easily compete with light industry. It is super likely that someone randomly has a breakthrough on some consumer good that you can't predict, and then you're automatically fucked. Another impact is on stability. If you have far less stability, then it is far more likely that layoffs happen during supply or demand shocks. If this happens, more people are unemployed, which leads to more riots and protesting against the CCP, which they already explained that the CCP is really afraid of. This also means that individuals are only able to purchase goods on our side because they have a long-term stable income. Okay, on to the on case. All right. They start with framing about why the interest of the CCP is going to be inherently with what's in the best interest of the peasants. While it's true that the CCP can't piss off the peasants too much for the warranting they give you, they vastly overestimate the degree to which they are acting in favor of the peasants. You can avoid a protest as long as you don't have total a hatred which they cannot prove. Additionally, things like the Vanguard Party mean that the CCP is already likely extremely corrupt, and so what's in the best interest of the CCP is going to be in the best interest of the industries and organizations that work with them for those same corruption reasons. Okay, they give us their first argument: transitioning to light industry is easier. They tell us the CCP does not have a strong economic base. It's easy to make them work in a factory where there is not that complicated a process in refining steel. However, it's far harder to make them do something meticulous and complicated like intricate clothing patterns, which they are not trained for. They tell us that heavy industry needs imports. This is non-unique. To make any factory, you need imports. Off-case proves that this isn't that bad because of the currency analysis, and you don't even need to import that much because you can just do the machinery part of the heavy industry rather than just processing steel. They tell us that Western countries won't support you. First of all, I think it's quite likely that they would support you when the alternative is the Soviet Union, which again is empirically just what happened. They tell us it's bad for Chinese currency. Our off-case currency argument beats this. At worst, this is a short-term harm. They tell us that light industry has a faster turnaround to exports and therefore less of a deficit. It's far more important. Right. What's far more important than this is who you can export to. No one is going to buy from you when you have no comparative advantage, so faster turnaround doesn't really matter. Okay, second argument. They tell us that light industry is just better for China. They tell us light is more diverse. First of all, this is just not true. There are technically more industries, but manufacturing is key to every single industry that has a physical good. They tell us that it's easier to change what the factory produces. I think this is super difficult on either side. If you switch from electronics to clothing, that seems negligibly easier than switching from steel to energy extraction. Even their own examples that they provide where we're staying within a specific industry and making the switch, they say something like shirts to blankets or whatever, is likely also non-unique. You still have to make significant changes to the factory line in the same way that you would switching from one type of car to another, or cars to trucks or whatever. The point is switching factories is hard anyway. They tell us that they tell us it's easier to pivot to avoid the competition. Every single part of light industry is already being done in some form in other places. Pivoting to avoid the competition means that you don't have clear infrastructure on anything. Trying to be flexible means you're mid at everything, and so you have no comparative advantage. Subpoint E, light industry aligns with bureaucratic interests. They tell us the party won't check back against heavy industry. Their own arguments about heavy industry being concentrated means that it is way better for the bureaucrats because the industry is centered with the bureaucrats. They tell us small-scale light industry means it makes it less likely for officials to be corrupt. Again, I think corruption is non-unique, but even if they tell us automation is less possible in light industry. This is only true on like the extremely short-term scale. As soon as any money gets put back into the factories, you're going to start building machines that automate that process. They tell us that this is better for workers. The stability argument in off-case beats this. They tell us that if the party does not help the poor, they'll get thrown out. Their previous arguments that is that bureaucrats matter more. Finally, light industry produces more money for the government. No, if you're importing a lot for heavy industry, you can add tariffs to get more money. Finally, they tell us capital is concentrated in heavy industry. It's easier to develop heavy industry than light industry per all the arguments about switching and flexibility. If you're going into light industry, you have to plan for every single contingency, whether you are outcompeted in clothing, agriculture, or electronics. This means that you have to build 3 different types of factories to plan for all the contingencies. However, on our side, when you plan for a very clear and predictable you can plan for a very clear and predictable comparative advantage. You can put all your money in one set of industries, of infrastructure.
Here.
Okay, this is going to be off case and then on case, but the on case responses will like mostly be integrated.
Wait, I'm sorry, you said off, not on?
Yeah.
Okay.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. There are 4 crucial questions that OP has to answer in this round. Number 1, not only is heavy industry economically good, but do peasants actually get to see this benefit, i.e. is the benefit diffused? Did not answer that in the LO. Number 2, we already gave you structural reasons to believe that even if developing heavy industry was good for a random country, it's obviously not good for China because of various aspects of their comparative advantage, i.e. their large population, their natural resource base, compared to the relatively limited existence of the kinds of iron that are needed for heavy machinery. And number 3, in the worst case scenario, who fares better? That is, we already told you that on both sides, there's a lot of economic and political volatility, which is why it's better to get some easy, quick wins rather than make sunk cost investments that take 10 to 15 years to actualize, because if anything goes wrong, you lose all of your money on their side of the house, also not responded to. And fourthly, do you even have the money to fund these things in the first place? Because they want to wave their magic wand and assume that all of these things can magically spawn. But we told you this takes immense amounts of borrowing that devalues your currency, that directly interacts with their currency argument. So either you have massive amounts of inflation in the short term, or you just can't build these things. MO has to respond to these things in order to win. Then, let's talk about what they say the CCP cares about, which is economic growth and buy-in. We already explained to you why the kinds of investments that they have on their side of the house just do not stimulate growth in the short term. But moreover, I think this is deeply politically unpopular for the people you actually care about the most, which is the peasants. There's a few reasons for this. Number one, this leads to large amounts of infighting. What we told you is that factories for heavy machinery are few and far in between, which means that you can only place this in certain, not very dense regions, which is very bad because this obviously leads to infighting between people like the coastal elites and different regional provinces, which fosters disunity within the party and increases the possibility of fracturing. But moreover, we told you that light industry creates the kinds of products that peasants consume on an everyday basis. This looks like literally growing food for them to eat and clothes for them to put on. The average peasant doesn't care about whether they can actualize a smartphone or heavy machinery if they're literally starving in the fields, which is the most important link into political buy-in, right? Because I care about the hunger in my tummy more than I care about having an AR-15. The next thing they talk about is that isolationism is very good. This is completely incoherent because I want to contextualize this historically. China has just come out of 2 opium wars and the Sino-Japanese War, where the West consistently goes in and colonizes the country because China was isolationist and didn't have economic ties with the rest of the world. Why do we solve for this? 3 reasons. Number one, we create actual resource dependency. That is, we see empirically, countries are way less likely to invade or impose imperialism if they're dependent on your resources and you have leverage over them. So in their best case, maybe you have heavy machinery that you yourself can rely on, but you're unlikely able to export these things in the short term, which is the reason why the West is likely to go in and colonize you again. Number 2, you're seen as very hostile and aggressive, both to the USSR and every other country in the world. If China starts massively producing machinery, this just looks like they're entering the global arms race and they don't even have the protection of the USSR in the first place. And thirdly, countries, when they build up good foreign capital reserves, i.e. you're able to store the currencies of other countries, they do not want to invade you because that would threaten the stability of the global monetary order. Whereas in their side of the house, the massive amounts of spending will likely deplete your reserves and give you more vulnerability on the global scale, which means you just have less FDI, less economic growth, and you're just much more vulnerable to the kinds of invasion or international instability that are likely to occur on their side of the house. The next thing they say is that you're just more diversified. It's super unclear to me why this is the case, because we already told you that number one, heavy machinery requires large lump sum investments, which means you just don't have capital mobility in the short term. But number two, the kinds of raw materials we're creating are just way more pivotable. Like you can see, for instance, factories easily pivoting from making alcohol and hand sanitizer in the COVID-19 outbreak, or the same textile industries being able to make clothing, or sofas or couches, which just means that these kinds of things are a lot more mobile because the industry and the kinds of equipment that you use are just a lot more are a lot less complex. But thirdly, we told you that labor is able to diversify a lot more in our side of the house. Like the kind of training you need to have one person to know how to operate a machine is obviously a lot less when people are working on production lines, which is relatively decentralized forms of labor, which is why on our side, we are able to pivot these industries to meet different kinds of demand, whereas diversification is just a lot worse on their side of the house, which is an offensive reason to vote for us. The next thing they explain is that you just do not have a comparative advantage. This argument is completely ludicrous for two reasons. Number one, we already told you that the USSR is likely to overproduce heavy machinery in the short term. And this is really obvious because they're coming out of World War II, which means that the military-industrial complex that is making tanks and planes could be transitioned towards heavy machinery a lot more. But moreover, the rest of the world is also structured in the same way, where they're overproducing heavy industry. So this means two things. Number one, China has a huge comparative advantage to fill in for the population boom and the growing industrialization where a lot of countries are demanding light industry. But second, and very pertinently, if you are trying to compete with your major trade partner, what is that going to do other than piss them off, right? Like Russia right now can trade you their heavy machinery at a very cheap cost for your light goods, which they do not have, which is the reason why we actually get what they want to produce for cheap on both sides of the house. But if you literally try to compete with Russia, you lose their investment, you lose their buy-in, you lose their support. It's quite simple. They say, oh, India can do the same things. Guys, that's looking at the status quo right now. Obviously, empirically, theoretically, if China were to move first, they have a first mover advantage, and all the reasons why they have a very mobile labor force coming out of World War II, and they have the explicit support of USSR, is the reason why they can differentiate themselves from India and Southeast Asia. In fact, their own argument is why you want to act right now, because if you act later, then the other countries can fill in, and you are systematically screwed over. The next thing they explain is that there's more riots and things like that. I already explained to you why the average person cares about whether they are employed and whether or not they have food on the table. On their side of the house, maybe you employ like very young, mobile young men, but you don't employ, for instance, like women, you don't employ older people, you don't employ the vast majority of the peasant population. And that's obviously really bad, because that means if the sole breadwinner of the house is taken out by a machine accident, which is very likely on their side of the house, then these peasants are structurally unemployed, and that's the reason why they're likely to riot and likely to rebel. Finally, they have this currency argument that is not very coherent. What we explained is that you need to print fiat currency in order to be able to afford these things, which devalues your currency in the long term and prevents you from being able to actualize any benefits that you want to talk about, such as buying imports, right? Because the average cost of something just goes up a lot more on their side of the house. Next thing they explain is that, the next thing they say is, the next thing they explain is that people are corrupt on both sides of the house. This is not our argument. Obviously, the incentive for corruption exists, but the question is who is better able to call out this corruption. Our argument is when you consolidate power into the hands of few, when you aren't able to see price signals because these things take a long time to manufacture, that's the thing that gives you the ability to siphon off money, the thing to take away the excess. And you cannot literally, have oversight over these things because it's very hard to quantify compared to light industry, which is obviously in the CCP's interest. Because if you imagine on their side of the house, if you give hella money to a few oligarchs, what do these oligarchs do? They consolidate power, and it's very easy for them to challenge the CCP. Whereas diffuse power is obviously in your interest because you don't create the landed gentry and elite that threaten your base. The next thing they explain is that peasants are not well trained for these things. Guys, this is not clear to me because obviously transitioning from being a peasant to doing light industry is way easier than learning the technological and manufacturing know-how it takes to transition to heavy industry. So obviously I think switching is somewhat difficult on both sides, but it's obviously far easier on our side. They explain that automation is symmetric on both sides of the house, but we explain that when you have multiple steps along the production lines, when you don't rely on machines doing the work for you, automation is a lot more difficult in 1949. Like, we're not talking about an age where ChatGPT is very widespread. Finally, they say you can use other things like tariffs. If you want to use tariffs to deck your economy, to prevent anyone from buying anything you ever export and import, fine. Immediately, that's a ballot for Gov. Very proud.
Hear, hear.
Okay. It's going to be offload. I'm going to start on the isolationism argument, and then I'll signpost from there. Is everyone ready? Starting in 3, 2, 1. Now, we do not say isolationism is good. That is not our case. Our case is when you stop being isolationist, which one is going to get you a larger economy? Our case is quite clear. You're going to be able to export more on our side of the house, and obviously if you export more and sell more goods, that is quite good. The first clash out of this is a stability argument. The first argument they make out of this is like, who else is producing like heavy industry? Just look at the empirics. Like, at the end of the day, China does end up outcompeting a lot of these people for a lot of the warrants that we give you that are just hand waved away by saying, these exist. First, the Soviet Union is going to be cooked soon. You know that. They are super politically unstable. And even though this is right after World War II, where all the bad shit just happened, no one wants to trade with the Soviet Union. They say you don't want to piss them off by competing with them. But because they are super politically unstable and dropped out of the LOC, that there are large amounts of other countries that don't want to trade with them right now, the Soviet Union is left with no options. So while the Soviet Union is overproducing, no one is buying from them because they don't want to support the people that were just on the other side of the war, or the people that just defected from everything. You can just see this happening empirically today after the Ukraine war, when half the world decided they were going to sanction Russia. Russia had to only export their oil to India, and they had to make some really fucked up trade terms with India. So the fucked up trade terms with India, where India just kept getting fixed prices and stuff like this, and were able to just extort the shit out of Russia, and Russia couldn't do anything because no one else wants to import from them. And that's exactly what is happening right now. So even if Russia might get pissed at you, they have no choice but to keep importing. This argument is not contested out of the LOC. But also, the comparative on India about the other people you are competing with is really, really important. They say you don't have a first mover, you have a first mover advantage if you start now. Our argument is upstream of this because we say no matter what, you don't have a first mover advantage on either. Russia either has a first mover advantage on the manufacturing and heavy industry, and countries like India and a lot of other countries in Southeast Asia have a first mover advantage on the light industry. What is really important here is their first mover advantage is a lot more drastic because India has been producing textiles since the first day they were colonized back in the 1700s. It has been 250 years where they've been doing this. They are entrenched, and they've been colonized by other countries like the Dutch and the European and the British, who are not only importing their goods, but taking it out to the rest of the world. So not only do they have a first mover advantage because they started earlier, they have large entrenched networks with other countries that are far more politically favorable than you. Whereas on the other side, even in the absolute worst case where there are some countries that are industrializing, the Industrial Revolution happened like literally a few decades ago. Your first mover advantage, even if there are other countries who do have a first mover advantage, it is not that bad. It is not nearly as bad. But also there are other draw mechanisms from the LOC that are quite clear on this. Even if the amount of investment and innovation you can do in heavy industry is far more proximate and goes far further on this than it would on light industry. Because in light industry, maybe, what are you going to do? Like innovate clothes? No, you just have to like continually make it cheaper and cheaper, which is something that is not really super profitable in the long run. And the electronics is also light industry per the info slide. So if like someone just comes up with a random innovation, which is something that is really hard to predict because innovations can happen from literally anybody. Smart people exist all across the world. Just matters on what they're researching, whether they're researching it first. You're absolutely fucked because you have to pivot. They say pivoting is okay, but I'll get to that later. But on our side of the house, there's no like random innovation that can magically make a factory a manufacturing sector 15 times more effective, which means you are far more insulated against other people, and whether there's large price shocks or whether the large supply shocks in the amount of light industry, which means on heavy industry, which means you know every time you invest in heavy industry, it will guarantee you returns. You don't know that when it comes to light industry. They say you lose support of the West. Why? How? We tell you the West is obviously going to want to support you over Russia and over all the other people that are industrializing, especially if you are insulated for a long period of time. Develop your industry, you get a lot of imports, you negotiate deals with Russia to get these imports for quite cheap, and they have no other option to turn to, and now you're the cheapest manufacturing option. Obviously they're going to care about you more. They say there's more vulnerability because of international instability. I'm just so unbelievably unclear what this international instability looks like. They're going to be like, China is making a manufacturing industry, so obviously they must be trying to attack me. America's so worried about this. Obviously no. Anytime you build up your economy, you're threatening to other economies. But that's not the reason they stop trading with you. That's the reason they start trading with you. Because when you have a more diversified economy, or you have a better overall, a more large economy, you're able to get prices for cheaper and give them more goods. Obviously they like this. This is not a reason they're going to be threatened. It's a reason they're going to import from you even more. The final thing that have to be under this is the currency argument. If we win this argument, we win that you export more and you get more money that you can reinvest and help the economy. We are going to bite the bullet that depreciation is good for you. Because when your currency is lower value, it means all the goods that you are importing also cost less for everybody else. And this is the comparative advantage, because while Russia is not printing money because they already went through 3 steps of hyperinflation, you haven't. So you can afford to take a little bit of inflation, because that inflation and currency depreciation means it is easier for every other country to buy your imports. And that's another comparative advantage you have over Russia and literally every single other country that is doing heavy industry that is cold conceded out of the LOC. Next clash. Which industry is easier to develop? Few layers to this. First is the employment argument. We're saying this is good for peasants because there's less easy job training, especially if you keep pivoting. These workers have no idea how to change. I want to be very clear about what their best case is. They say you could just be mobile and have a comparative advantage in a lot of things. No, if you're being mobile, you have a comparative advantage in absolutely nothing. The LOC analysis is quite clear on this. You just have to be mid at a bunch of different tiny things. In the in light industry. Because if India randomly gets finds like a new huge place of textiles, or India randomly generates a new electronic way to farm, a new mechanical innovation to start farming their textiles super well, you're absolutely cooked. And if you for the same electronics argument I gave, if you're in electronics and someone did something really good in electronics, you're absolutely cooked. But you have to keep pivoting. Even in their absolute best case, pivoting might be somewhat easy, but it's not that easy. The example they give is factories shifted from doing alcohol and started doing hand sanitizer in COVID. Few things. First, this was forced. They were only if it was the case that it was so easy to do this and so comparatively advantageous to do this, they would just do this anytime the flu season exists. Obviously, alcohol factories are not shifting every single flu season. The only reason they are doing it is because they're forced to. But also, even if you buy their best case that they can happen, it is quite hard to happen, because even alcohol to soap, even alcohol to hand sanitizer tank these companies' revenue in the short term, which means in that short term they have to do large amounts of layoffs, or these employees didn't know how to make soap instead of alcohol. And this is a super, super tiny change. If you have to go from electronics to clothing, obviously this matters more. And this is where you turn all the peasants' arguments, because the peasants have to keep learning a new type of trade every 2 months because they keep losing out on the comparative advantage to all the countries that you have literally nothing over for the previous argument. then the peasants are pissed off because they either lose their job or they keep learning something new, and in the interim they're not getting paid, or in the interim their jobs are laid off because the factory has to be built differently. This also proves that we are more likely to get a far more stable and far better infrastructure in heavy industry, because you always know that heavy industry will work. They just wave off heavy industry by saying it's not diversified. Yes, it is. Steel is used in the intermediary process of almost every single good. So it doesn't matter if one industry collapses, there are 15 others that are using steel. And it doesn't matter if energy collapses for one country. Every single country uses energy. And this is also how you appease the peasants. Sure, they care about clothes and stuff like this, but you can import those, and we beat the short-term importing arguments because you only need importing for the short term on our side of the house, because you only need to import enough steel to you don't only need to import enough steel to build a factory, whereas on their side of the house you have to keep importing forever. But either way, you can import these minor needs like food and clothes, and these are probably things that you have the resources to do anyways because you already have farms in the countryside. But on their side of the house, the peasants are far worse off because they just don't have energy. You can appease the peasants by just giving them oil and natural gas to turn their lights on. That's something they care about. That's a way you could help them as well. Okay. Next clash. What is good for the people in the country? First is the stability of jobs argument. Sell stuff to the peasants. You can sell the manufacturing goods that you make to the peasants. Obviously, you're making intermediary goods, so you're part of the manufacturing process. But once you finish the manufacturing process, you can just import those things back. And the reason you're able to import those things back is because you're able to export a lot, so you have a better trade balance, which beats all their arguments on the currency and importing stuff. Because if you're exporting a lot more, you have a better trade balance, which means you have the capacity to import more to meet these peasants' goods in the first place. But also, you can just bring people into the city. If their argument is true that heavy machinery factories are far fewer and far between, that is a good thing because you bring the peasants into the areas where economic activity exists. They don't want to be in the farms and the countryside because there's no one to help them. That's where they fear all the corruption will happen, because they see no officials near them. They see no one in the government taking care of them, which beats back all their arguments. This also beats all the short-term arguments, because if it is the case the bureaucrats matter a lot in the short term, then it is a good thing that you're giving them a lot of funding. They can't overthrow you. If they do try to overthrow you, you can just jack-mod them and poof them into existence. On our side, you actually appease the bureaucrats, who probably matter far more because we both agree that you are corrupt, and you appease them by just giving them money to run these industries, which you can't do on their side because they keep switching and they can't keep those subsidies. Proud to oppose.
Here, here.
LR is just going to be balance. The first battle here is going to be on exports. You just sell more. You will eventually stop being isolationist. Once that happens, you will want to be in a position where you can trade with others. We already gave you the warranty as to why you probably can kickstart your industry relatively cheaply, because the USSR is your only option, and they're in a situation where they're sanctioned by everyone and therefore can only really sell to you. As such, you kickstart cheaply. But once you've reached that point, the fact of the matter is, it's so much easier to sell abroad if you are in heavy industry than in light industry. Several warrants, none of which are properly responded to. You have the currency argument, the fact that depreciation is dead. Additionally, there is just the fact that you can specialize in something that's that's either A, quite specific at the end of the manufacturing process, or something that is required as an intermediary for everything. Both of these makes it so that you are an option where you're not really competing very much. None of this is true on Gov, where you are making clothing, something that dozens of other countries are making, something whose process for manufacturing is already quite developed, and something that you don't really have the ability to to make any significant changes in. As such, on their side, you have no access to these. No access to these foreign markets because you're outcompeted by other countries. Whereas on our side, you aren't, just because the thing that you are selling is more in demand and the competition is significantly lesser. Especially because your primary competition, once you've developed, is going to be the USSR. But here's the thing: no one wants to buy from the USSR, and so you are so much more integrated. Okay, second ballot here is going to be on what's in the best interest for the CCP. The CCP cares more about this because you become a more a stable major country significantly faster. You become integrated with the West. You get to move past your dependence on the Soviet Union. And, more importantly, you make money faster. This leads to a massive development of the economy, which subsumes all of gov arguments about the government funding for various things and what's in the best interest for the peasants. And on the way, we just say, first of all, we care about what the CCP has to say, not the average Chinese citizen, and I will get to that in a moment. But second of all, you just get to develop your economy much faster. The CCP has more money with which to spend both on whatever the factors of state are that are important to them. Okay, on to gov ballot. Okay, the primary gov ballot here is likely to be on what's in the best interest of the peasants. First of all, I think we do win this ballot. Op-world is better for the for the peasantry. A few reasons. First of all, benefits to the peasants. First of all, benefits to the peasants is upstream from your ability to export products. If you cannot export, you don't. Peasants lose their job. That's bad for them. Why do we export more? All the reasoning just given. Second of all, a situation on their side where peasants keep switching jobs is bad for them. When people keep losing their jobs over and over, as per Pranav's argument, it supercharges the LOC claim as to why they're going to be more likely to riot. And also, not having a job is less likely to cause you to riot than if your job keeps appearing and disappearing every 3 months. You also just don't have a job on their side because training in something super intricate and meticulous like electronics or clothing is just something they don't have training for, but they can easily train for a factory assembly line that does the same thing over and over. This also beats their argument about only hiring young men, because literally anyone can do an assembly line factory job, which is only stable on our side of the house. Finally, peasants are far happier when they're brought into the city where the economic activity, where all the economic activity is. But here's the thing: even if this is not even if this is not the case, and you buy everything they have to say about peasants, and they win on peasants, it doesn't matter. The CCP does not care about the peasants that much. The CCP only needs to help the peasants do the bare minimum that they don't riot. Once we hit that, all that matters after that point is what's in the best interest of the CCP, which we win cleanly. More important than the peasants are the bureaucrats, because the CCP is corrupt and the oligarchs are good for them. They themselves prove that the bureaucrats are happier.
Here's 2 thoughts.
Here.
Be an observation, like a thing at the top, some values, ballots, and then response to LOR. Throughout this whole round, OP never engaged with the fact that China is in a very unique position at this point in time and as a nation itself. You have just come out of 2 major wars, so you're very unstable right now. You're just in a transition of power, so your government is weak. And as a nation with a very unique set of demographics in terms of the scale of your population and the resources you physically have access to, what is good for you as China is very different from what is generally good for other nations. Why is this important? A couple things. First, consider the political stability. The CCP right now is a very unstable party. It does not have the governmental influence or power that it does in the modern day. Because of this, even if you buy that the CCP is corrupt or is going to become more corrupt in the future or whatever, right? We would still say corrupt individuals care about having power. And insofar as the CCP does not have power right now, it's going to be looking into what is the best way to secure that power. They say that riots are going to be unlikely, but again, the nation is not doing well. You just came out of 2 wars. Your people are in a very unstable position, so you need to make them happy, especially in the short term. Otherwise, they are going to riot, and any level of riot is going to ruin your power. On that, the balance. First, is simply that nobody is going to buy your products if you specialize in heavy machinery. As they never respond to, sure, Russia specifically is heavily limited, but they never respond to the fact, it's clean dropped, that every other country also prioritizes heavy machinery. Why are people going to buy your heavy machinery when they're already making it themselves? They say specialization is good. Sure, everyone is already doing heavy machinery, so you specialize in the one field no one else is. They're India and Southeast Asian countries are doing textiles specifically. First, not yet. They say there's some production production, like, yes, obviously every nation produces some level of textiles, but not at the scale that we are talking about. We are saying prioritize light industries like textiles at a scale at which you can export those goods. India is not doing that now at this point in time, and as such, when you step in, you fill that space in like the global economy. That is specifically what brings like people into your markets. They never prove like anyone wants all these industries. Moreover, like at this point in time specifically, your main partner is Russia. So even if like in the long term, somehow, some way, like it's okay for you to like have some conflict with them, at this specific point in time, you are still fundamentally reliant on the goods that they provide. They say, oh well, you can just trade with the US. Even if you buy that like the US has some incentive to want to trade with you because like they want to like decrease like the power of the USSR. First, you're still a communist party, and so at the end of the day, the US still has like some reservations about working with you. But secondarily, sure.
I think the argument that the US has reservations about working with you because you're communist is different than the MG response, which is Western countries are threatened because you're like attacking them economically by building up a huge industry.
I think we had from
I mean, like we say, the West has no incentive to work with you. If you want to debate about like what the example of
Yeah,
is.
I don't think it's an example. I think I think you give a warrant for why the West doesn't want to work with you, and that's like they're threatened by you building up a super big economy. I think the West doesn't want to work with you for the warrant that you are also communist is new.
I mean, I think throughout the case we say the only trade partner of China is the Soviets because they're both communist. If the inverse of that, like the West isn't trading with you because you're communist, is new. Like that's fine.
I'm gonna lean towards well taken, but I'll take it under consideration. I have 231 labs.
I guess I have like Western countries, I feel like from case, Western countries entering the Cold War will be very unwilling to support a communist government in China.
Is that in PMC?
Yeah.
Can you tell me where in PMC?
It was subpoint B, China will have to import raw materials, and then it was the third reason, because we're entering the Cold War, so it's like they're anti-communist.
Oh, yeah.
From my flow, I think this is a short-term argument, and now they're making a long-term argument, but up to consideration.
Yeah, let's just move on for now.
Okay.
Whenever you're ready.
I have 230 used.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so a few minutes left. What was it? Start on this. But even if you buy this like only in the short term, we would say that's still significant because again, you're at a weak point right now, and so it takes time for you to transition to these like Western imports. It's better to stay with your friends that being the USSR, they have heavy manufacturing, you prioritize light manufacturing. It's better for both of you in the short term, which again is most relevant because this is a specifically weak point in your like political power. The next place to consider is peasants and their overability. First, peasants are just going to starve if you prioritize heavy machinery because they aren't able to buy expensive things because they're unemployed right now. Remember, the Communist Party was created for the people. This is like the reason why people supported it in the first place. So again, this feeds into like your like voter base. But there's a couple reasons here. First, there's just a finite number of jobs, even if you spread them out, and heavy machinery has less access to these jobs. There's simply fewer jobs to give to the people. We give you a few reasons that I never responded to, mainly that these jobs are much easier like to industrialize and have like no longer the need for the workers. But secondly, you're simply not producing the food you need on the off because you're prioritizing heavy industry, so you don't like create the resources that people need in the first place. Moreover, bureaucrats specifically aren't even going to like you because you only have a couple of them as compared to having more wealth for more people in general. But moreover, consider the inflation argument. We tell you that when you have this like massive trade deficit, this decreases the value of your currency. So even if you buy that like you're able to import like some important goods that would be good in general, holistically, the entire of your populace is suffering more because your currency is less valuable. They don't have access to currency because they're not working, they're not employed, and so the collective of your population is suffering. They don't have access to like base resources like food, shelter, water, etc. Your people are going to be upset. Obviously, they're going to riot. The last, right. On then to the op ballots. They mainly tell you like exports. The argument being like you'll specialize in like one heavy industry, not like sets you for life. A couple issues. First, again, as never responded to, the entire world already specializes in these exports. They're not like a great specific niche that you can like fill in here. Nations are like have incentives to prioritize their own heavy exports, so you're not filling like a specific gap. But moreover, like again, you have specific allies who you are like in this specific moment in time reliant on it, that being the USSR. You don't want to piss them off because of the fact that that hurts your economy in the short term, which again is the most important point to consider in this round. They then tell you that like economic growth in like the long run will come from heavy like machinery. Again, not as important. Even if you buy that there's some long-term gains, it's outweighed by the fact that in the short term, your peasants are suffering. They don't have access to the resources they need, the money that they need. They're going to revolt against you. Still bad for you on that. They give you a couple of things here on peasants. First, they tell you that like you'll need to export to some degree. You can still export like the light industries that you're doing. Would say again for a number of reasons why this is better. But second, they say that like peasants like want to be in the city and like move into the city, but then response by there's still a limited number of jobs with these industries. It doesn't matter if there's some migration towards cities. Obviously, some people are still left behind. You still have a number of peasants who do not have access to what they need. This is a specific group of people who riot, ruin your political stability, try to propose.
Here, here.
Right round, y'all.
Thank you for your rounds.